Oh, wonderful. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn. My name is Mary Beth Walsh. I am the Director of Programs with NAMI Virginia, which includes the Virginia Family Network, a network for parents to connect who have similar experiences with having a child living with a mental health condition. Today we are joined for our lunch and learn. I'm very excited. We're joined with Amanda Lynch. She is with Greater SCAN of Richmond. SCAN stands for Stop Child Abuse Now, and she's going to be talking with us today about generational trauma and racial disparities. Because we're on Facebook Live, if you are watching this on Facebook and you have comments or questions, please put them in the comment section. We will be monitoring that. If you have questions watching this later on, we might have some ways for you to connect so you can get your questions answered. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and turn it on over to Amanda. Amanda, take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here with you all this afternoon. If your day has been anything like mine, I'm running between a million different things and certainly happy to spend lunchtime with you all to talk about generational trauma and racial disparities. I am a trauma-informed specialist at Greater Richmond SCAN, primarily doing work at Metro Richmond Boys and Girls Clubs. That's all of the clubs in the city, and then the one down in Petersburg as well. So helping our organization, families, and those that we serve to just be more trauma-informed. So we'll go ahead and get started. So a few things that we'll discuss today. We'll talk about trauma and the many different forms of trauma. We'll also review epigenetics, historical and racial trauma. Then we'll talk about how trauma impacts brain development, and then how you can build resilience in yourself and then also those that you serve. And we all here believe that racism in all of its forms is another form of trauma as well. We have a few videos here. Hopefully the sound will come through clearly.
Many people think white supremacy is just like neo-Nazis and KKK members, but those guys, they're just the most visible tip of the iceberg, along with stuff like genocide, hate crimes, lynching, hate groups, the stuff good folks agree is bad. But beneath that cold, dark water is actually most of the structure that keeps white supremacy rolling along. Like police brutality, some states not even having laws against hate crimes, legacy of Jim Crow laws, gerrymandering, mass incarceration, prison pipeline, breaking treaties made with Native Americans, and much, much more. And then as we move deeper down the iceberg, we get to the harder stuff to see. Hearing racist jokes and not challenging racist rage baiting in the media. A black guy not being born in America. COVID-19. The Chinese virus. Being afraid of eating halal meat. Lives matter. I just can't pronounce your name. All the way down to, I never even owned slaves. The problem is, it's too easy to look up at the top and say, what a bunch of assholes. That's white supremacy, and I'm not that. It's everything else.
And so we'll talk today about some of those things that we don't necessarily see at the tip of the iceberg, some of those underlying ways that racism and systematic racism can embed themselves in our community, at work, in the ways that we live. And so before we jump into that, I thought it might be nice if we just took a moment to do a quick breath work activity. I know that it's lunchtime, and so many of us have had super busy mornings. I'm not immune to that myself, and it's sometimes nice to just sit and catch your breath. So I invite you to come to the tip of your chair, bringing your feet flat against the floor or earth. Bringing your shoulders back and chest forward, really opening up your heart space. And I invite you to close your eyes if that is available to you today. However, if you would prefer to find somewhere to fix your gaze, maybe rest your eyes on a spot on the wall, maybe at your hands or feet. And just take a moment to notice your breath. Softening your face and jaw. thanking yourself for showing up today, not for me, but for you. Breathing in deeply and breathing out fully. Taking a few more deep, cleansing breaths. Here on your breath. If you find that your mind is imagining that you are sitting on the bank of a river, watching those thoughts float upstream and away from you. Giving yourself permission to take just a moment to be. Resisting the urge to plan, to think about what's next, and focusing only on this moment and only on this time that we have together. And when you are ready, take 2 final deep cleansing breaths. Slowly and deeply. And open your eyes to rejoin the space, bringing your attention and your awareness back here to our time together. And so for those of you who might be watching live, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being the worst and 10 being the best, just think about how you're feeling in this moment. Maybe even giving that feeling a 1-word label to describe how you're feeling right now. I know for me, I'm feeling pretty settled. Some of you may be feeling happy. Others may be feeling stressed. And if this feeling is something that you don't want to carry, I encourage you to just release it and let it go. And so as we talk about trauma today, we understand that trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that someone can have happen to them that can be physical, emotional, can be life-threatening, but it also has a lasting adverse effect on one's mental, physical, social, or spiritual well-being. It can be a real or perceived threat. Again, it can be physical or emotional. Trauma is also very subjective. So 2 people could have the same event and have a very different experience with that, and it can have a very different long-term effect. I like to use the example of my parents getting divorced. I was 2 years old when my parents got divorced. My sister was 12 and my brother was 13. Same event, the way that I, as a toddler, experienced that was much different than the 2 of them who were preteens. There's several different types of trauma. So an acute form of trauma is something that is very limited amount of time. It's a single event. That can be something like a house fire, a car accident even. Then we think about those chronic forms of trauma. This tends to show up for a lot of the young people that I serve that live in communities that might be plagued with community or domestic violence. So these are multiple traumatic events, again, that occur over a long period of time. And then we have that complex form of trauma, where it's multiple traumatic events that likely happen at a very young age between, let's say, birth and age 6, which is our most crucial time of brain development. This tends to be an ongoing form of abuse. It can be sexual, physical, emotional abuse, or even neglect. Often it's at the hands of a caregiver or a trusted adult, right? And because it happens during that most crucial time of brain development, it can also disrupt many aspects of a child's typical development. A child may be impacted and have a difficult time feeling safe, or struggle with self-worth, or even a hard time forming those loving and caring attachments. And so when we think about some other traumatic events, we think about community domestic violence, car accidents, an injury or illness, maybe even having a caretaker that has an injury or illness, also being a victim or witness to violence. That can be within the community again, or domestic. Living through or surviving through a natural or man-made disaster. What always comes to mind for me here is the displacement of so many residents of New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, right? That certainly would be a traumatic event. Abuse and neglect, homelessness, or any type of forced displacement. So even being a refugee, or maybe being evicted from your home. Terrorism or war, having your own substance use disorder, or being a witness to someone within your family that has a substance use disorder. Oppression and racism, which we'll delve into next. Sudden or violent loss of a loved one. Military family related stressors, so any type of deployment can certainly be a traumatic event, and we don't always think about how deployment impacts everyone in the household. And then vicarious or secondary trauma. And so for me, this work is very personal. It's also professional, obviously. I'm here with you all. But when I think about my experiences as a classroom teacher working in Richmond City, a lot of the community violence that my students were experiencing, I also noticed that those things were showing up in my body as toxic stress, right? And so really thinking about how vicarious and secondary trauma also play a part in how we're impacted by trauma. When trauma happens again at those early developmental stages, it can alter our brain.
Racial trauma isn't just something that Black and Brown Americans experience regularly. It's something health experts say they're born into.
What makes it traumatic is how you experience it.
Similar to PTSD, racial trauma, or race-based traumatic stress, is the collective effect racism has on an individual's mental and physical health. It can be from major experiences like workplace discrimination or hate crimes, or it can be the result of an accumulation of many small indignities called microaggressions, or system or institutions that enforce structural oppression.
There was a national survey done by the American Psychological Association, and about 25% of all African Americans, 30% of all Native Americans report at least one of those experiences at least once a week.
The APA says not only do Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian American people significantly suffer from racial trauma, but that it can also compound with additional oppression based on gender or sexual orientation.
It depends on the intensity and the frequency of how often you experience racism or how severe the event is, but you might start with just race-based stress. So something will be racist and you'll be exposed to it and you'll feel stress. But racial trauma is really when it has those long-term effects. It really sticks with you.
Immediate symptoms can include increased heart rate or blood pressure, heightened cortisol levels, sweating, or tension in the body. Long-term chronic exhaustion and fatigue are among the most common symptoms.
Just sadness, underlying or overt anger, even thinking differently about yourself. So sometimes believing or starting to endorse those stereotypes that people might have about your racial group. If you're experiencing racial trauma, you might have some of that internalized racism.
Increased hypervigilance, the having the nightmares or flashbacks, avoidance of situations where they may, perceive it as threatening. All of those are consistent with what we find in race-related stress and PTSD. So there's a lot of overlap.
Kind of, bouncing back and forth between that and numb, and never really feeling safe and socially connected and supported. And that also affects your brain and how your brain develops.
America's healthcare system impacts racial trauma too, making it more difficult not only to find help, but someone who understands a patient's experience. A 2015 study found that in the U.S., 86% of psychologists were white, 5% were Asian, 5% were Hispanic, 4% were black. Meanwhile, some of the experts we spoke to are setting out to help. Dr. Candace Nicole Hargens released Black Lives Matter meditations for racial trauma victims and white allies.
Black lives matter.
Therapist Kelly Baker has helped organize Facebook Live videos with her local NAACP branch where anyone can connect to learn more about racial trauma. She's included sharing her own experiences.
I don't think you can say that there was ever a time for me when I did not, that I was never exposed to racism. You know, when I think about my family, you know, my mom, my grandmother, and the things that my mother experienced that were clearly racist definitely affected how she parented her children.
What can be done to respond to racial trauma? Dr. Erlanger Turner tells Newsy adding an official diagnosis of racial trauma to the DSM-5, an encyclopedia of sorts for mental health professionals, is not the solution. He suggests racial trauma's existence is something everyone should be aware of, especially healthcare providers and policymakers.
If you are white, you do need to make sure that you try to understand that person's experience, that you provide some sense of solidarity, that you don't apologize. I think people oftentimes want to apologize in these situations, and that's really not helpful. We need solutions. And so I think that is one of those things that we have to do better and make sure that we take ownership.
Lindsay Thies, Newsy, Denver.
And so just taking that conversation a step further, right? It was news to me up until about 5 years ago that trauma could be passed down for generations within our genetic code, right? And so there are lots of studies that have been done on indigenous communities today, the ancestors of Black enslaved Americans, and then also the ancestors of Holocaust survivors, and just noticing some things that come up intergenerationally. One of the leading researchers in this field of epigenetics would be Dr. David Diamond. He is a professor at University of South Florida, and he studied the effects of stress-related hormones in rats for many decades, right? I came into contact with him through a brain-based learning conference that I attended a few years ago in San Antonio. But a few things that he noticed within his research was that high cortisol levels affect the hippocampus, which is a key learning center in our brain. It's where things like memory are housed. Chronic stress also actually shrinks the hippocampus, so it makes it smaller, which causes it to impairments in learning, memory, and mood. One experiment or study that he'd done was to take a group of pregnant rats and put them in cages, right? Every time these rats were introduced to the smell of cherry blossoms, something unpleasant happened, whether they were deprived of food or whether they were given some small shock. There was just something unpleasant that happened to this group of rats when this smell was introduced, right? So the mother rats go on to have their pups. The pups are almost immediately removed from the cages. They've never been introduced directly to this smell. However, when this smell was finally introduced to them, they immediately became frightened. Something within their survival code, within their genetic code had been turned on, right? To say that, okay, this is something that we need to be scared of. We also have noted that chronic stress from frequent racist encounters is associated with having a chronic low-grade inflammation, which is almost like having a low-grade fever all the time, right? So what this does, it dysregulates the body in a way that could put someone at a higher risk for heart attack or stroke, things like heart disease, cardiovascular diseases, and disorders. Scientists have also noticed that there have been correlations made between discrimination and various measures of accelerated aging, even noticing some changes in the tips of people's chromosomes and subtle alterations in their genetic activity. And then further looking at the field of epigenetics, if you look at that picture on the left, you see there's a young lady in the middle. There are lots of environmental exposures, stresses, diet, lifestyle that can all induce epigenetic changes. And I'll just say epigenetics is sort of like, if you imagine turning on a light switch, so turning on things within your genetic code, but it can also turn things off within your genetic code, right? So if you look at the mom on the right, that's in that first picture, and you notice that she's smoking. Smoking can and has been linked to having anxiety. So she's smoking, which is, of course, an unhealthy coping mechanism, maybe to stress, maybe anxiety, right? But you also notice that she's pregnant. And so you see she has a little girl that's in red, and the little girl has a little blue dot in the middle of her tummy. Those would be the unborn granddaughter's reproductive cells. So you notice that in that second and third picture, that grandma has introduced epigenetic changes within herself, but also within her unborn daughter, and then her unborn granddaughter's reproductive cells as well. So looking again at racial trauma, Black adults are less likely than white adults to trust a variety of groups and institutions, including healthcare. And so if you look at the statistics for Black American adults who say that they can trust doctors, it's 59%, as opposed to Hispanic Americans, it's 72%, and then white Americans, it's 78%. Some of this goes back to things that have happened in history, like the Tuskegee experiments, for example, going back to what happened with Henrietta Lacks, looking at the limited doctors that are available that are Black and brown, and so not feeling a sense of safety and trust there as well. And this continues with looking at hospitals. 56% of Black Americans report that they feel they can trust hospitals, as opposed to white Americans who say 70%. Even going down to the police, where 30% of Black Americans feel that they can trust the police, whereas 56% of Hispanic Americans and then 72% of white Americans report that they feel that they can also trust the police. And this survey was conducted last summer between August 20th and September 14th. I believe that anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including within yourself, right? So we all have biases. Some of these conversations may be uncomfortable. Some things may come up for you as you start to do anti-racist work, as you start to move from being an ally to being someone who is passionate about anti-racism. And that's okay. I encourage those of you who may feel uncomfortable to just sit with that and sort of explore where that feeling is coming from. Here in Virginia, and also locally here in Richmond, Virginia, which is where I'm based, racism has been declared a public health crisis, right? And so funding sources will hopefully open up here soon within our state and also locally to explore things like redlining, disparities in schools, disparities in healthcare, to sort of get to the root of some of these problems as well. And so when we look at this from a trauma-informed approach, we want to realize first the widespread impact that racial trauma may have in an organization or in someone. We want to recognize those symptoms of racial trauma, which can mimic, again, we talked about having that low-grade fever, being set up for heart disease, cardiovascular issues. Also, some of the signs and symptoms can show up like PTSD and anxiety, right? But then we also want to be able to integrate this knowledge about racial trauma into our policies, procedures, and practices so that we can respond and actively work to resist re-traumatizing those that we work with and serve. Again, looking at realize, right? And so if we're looking at behaviors, from the context of a coping strategy that someone uses to survive in the world in which they live. So if someone feels distrusting of the COVID vaccine, for example, understanding why those numbers in the Black community may be low, and then working towards policies and programs that help dispel some of those myths and distrust that maybe exist. Also understanding that racial trauma does definitely play a role in mental and substance use disorders, but there are paths for recovery as well. When we think about just the overarching theme of trauma on brain development, we also need to understand that the brain develops what it needs to survive, and that the pathways that are used most frequently get stronger versus those pathways that are not used as frequently, they'll get weaker. Our brain is uniquely designed to live in the worlds in which we work and live in. So if we look at this child's brain on the side, we want to remember that our brains develop from bottom up. The only part of our brain that is fully developed when we're born is our brainstem, right? And so I'm so used to doing a hand model of the brain. So that base of the brain that's responsible for sending signals to our body, like it's time to breathe or our blood is flowing, right? So just those basic things. And then our brain starts to grow. So think about walking upstairs. So that next set of stairs, that would be that survival part of our brain, where things like fight, flight, or freeze are housed. And so if you are in an environment where you are frequently experiencing racist encounters, trauma, and or abuse, that downstairs part of your brain is going to be really heavy, because what your brain is signaling to your body is that I'm not safe, either physically or emotionally, right? I'm not safe. So you're going to have that that downstairs pathway, that downstairs part of your brain, that barking dog or security guard is going to be really strong. What we're asking our students, our clients, our family, friends, community members to do is to pull from that upstairs part of the brain, right? Some of our friends, family, students may not be there yet, but recovery is possible. So again, if you look at the neurons and the neural pathways from that top picture, that's a really healthy brain. You see lots of areas lit up. There's not a lot of black space, right? You see a lot of neural activity happening there, as opposed to the brain on the bottom, which is a brain that's been exposed to trauma. There are not a lot of neurological connections happening there. I think a lot about, I always use this for my example here, those old school Christmas lights. I think they probably stopped using them in the 80s, where like if one bulb went out, that whole strand was disrupted. Trauma is really the same way. And so if we look at that healthy brain at the top, right, all those lights are working, as opposed to the bottom, where the more trauma you pour into someone, the more likely their neural pathways are to have been disrupted. And so again, looking at just another image of the brain, that's a healthy 3-year-old on the left, as opposed to the right, where that's the brain of a 3-year-old Romanian orphan who has suffered some sort of severe sensory deprivation. You notice that although these children are the same age, that brain is much smaller. The holes on the inside are very large. The white matter on the outside of the brain on the right is shrunken, so there's not a lot of protective layer there. And this is just with someone that's 3 years old. So we also want to think about, is something a brain-based issue or is it a behavior problem, right? Remembering that children and people adapt to survive in the environment that they're in. So what may appear as a poor behavior could actually be a survival skill. Just touching briefly on the case study, this isn't a comprehensive list of all of the traumas that could possibly happen to someone, but this was one of the very first studies that was done in the early 90s by Dr. Vincent Folletti and Dr. Anda, that showed a distinct relationship between early childhood trauma and health and well-being problems later in life. Again, the more trauma you pour into someone, the more likely you may be to develop a whole host of social, emotional, and cognitive impairments, which may set you up for failure in school, difficulty holding a job, high risk behaviors, disease, disability, and a whole host of societal social problems, okay, which can also lead to early death. Some of the statistics that we're looking at here in Richmond City, there's about a 20-year life expectancy difference between residents in Gilpin Court as compared to the more affluent section of Richmond, which would be in the West End. So same city, much different life expectancy. And then also looking at cases with adverse childhood experiences. Some people have coined the term adverse colonial experience, which would pull in like these racist encounters, racial trauma that we're talking about here today that wasn't included on that initial ACE questionnaire. Also talking about adverse COVID experiences. And so not really knowing how the stress, the grief, the loss, all of the things that have occurred over the past 15 months, how that may show up for young people when they return to school, for those of us who will be returning into office spaces. And so just thinking about ACEs as not only being adverse childhood experiences, but also after COVID experiences, and then after colonial or adverse colonial experiences as well. And so with this knowledge, we want to recognize those signs and symptoms of trauma, whether it's racial or really any kind of trauma in clients, family, and staff, right? So noticing that some of the behaviors that we see is in response to trauma. Looking at how we screen and assess to gather that information, and also just making sure that that's done with fidelity and respect so that we don't re-traumatize those that we are working so hard to help as we try to assess what has happened to them. And so if we were live, I would take a few minutes and have you all really think about when you first became aware of your racial identity, okay? So I want you to think about that for yourself and maybe ask a friend, a family member, or neighbor who maybe doesn't share in your same racial makeup or culture, right? Often when I do this workshop, those of us who are Black or Brown, or many participants who maybe are first generation Americans, were made aware of their racial identity in elementary school, right? Some event happened that quickly made them aware of their racial identity. So I would challenge you to maybe explore that within your friend groups, within yourself, and really just think about that. It's not a question that we typically ask, but it's certainly helpful in this conversation to understand the perceptions and backgrounds of others. So when we look at racism and looking at it from a systematic and systemic space, we also want to think about what causes those patterns to be maintained, right? So looking again at structural racism, that's social, economic, and political, right? So what causes these structures to hold on to some of these racist patterns that might exist within it, right? And so that's also talking about public policy and practices. And then with institutional, thinking about racism and race across institutions, like schools even, that sometimes might put certain groups at a disadvantage. And then also taking a moment, like I said, with that question about when did you notice your racial identity? So thinking about those face-to-face covert actions towards persons that express racial prejudice, hate, or bias. Again, same thing, like thinking about your private beliefs and biases that you may hold, ideas that individuals may have, right? And then with interpersonal, how is that expressed between individuals? Have you been in a situation where someone has told an uncomfortable joke and maybe you laughed because you were uncomfortable responding, or maybe didn't know how to react, right? So thinking about how those interpersonal things show up as well. And then with institutional, being witness to those discriminatory practices and treatments, those policies, those things that might exist within organizations and institutions. And then lastly, looking again at structural. So thinking about that system in which public policies, practices, and other norms, how can they sometimes perpetuate racial group inequality? And also just keep thinking about what racial trauma might look like within yourself or in your community. An example of that, again, would be going back to healthcare. And so maybe for me, as a mom, or if I'm pregnant, understanding that the mortality rate is much different for Black women than it is much greater than for white mothers. And so that could be traumatizing if I'm talking to my doctor and the doctor believes that my pain threshold is higher because of my race, right? And so maybe I'm not being believed. Maybe I don't have access to park space or green spaces or fresh fruits and vegetables, right? So thinking about those things too. Those can also be ways that racial trauma show up. I always use the example of pregnancy because I had 3 very traumatic pregnancies. And thankfully, I have a Black woman doctor who didn't hold some of those biases that we may see and when we research these things, right? I think there was a study done last year where a good percentage of medical students believed that Black American skin was thicker and therefore we have a higher pain tolerance, right? So those stereotypical things that may carry over from generation to generation, those are some ways that racial trauma might show up in our community. The way schools are funded, housing inequalities, these are just some other examples of the ways that racial trauma may show up. I grew up in a community where the police were our friends. I ran into our school resource officer a couple of years ago and was super excited to see him. Whereas my husband grew up in a very over-policed community, so his perception of the community is one of police is one of distrust, right? Which is why community policing is very important. So these are just some examples that come to mind for me when I think about racial trauma. Some other possible signs and symptoms: often thinking the worst of yourself and others, pervasive feelings of fear and anxiety, having a really hard time trusting others. So remember, I just mentioned trusting healthcare, trusting the police. Maybe I haven't had good, healthy school experiences either. So maybe trusting those kinds of systems as well. Perceiving adults and people that are in positions of trust as a threat. Rarely feeling safe. Having a hard time managing emotions and any additional stress, right? So almost like that straw that broke the camel's back, even if it's something that seems small, like saying good morning. Well, I don't know that Amanda's hungry and she didn't sleep well, and all of these things have sort of stacked up against her even before she got to school. So thinking about the ways that kids sometimes respond or react versus respond rather. Our response to stress continuing to be that fight, flight, freeze. So really not understanding how to manage one's emotions, right? Because your body's dysregulated. Change and transition can also be difficult. Struggling and having challenges with problem solving, learning, and memory. Remember, we talked about how toxic stress and racial trauma can impact that hippocampus. And the hippocampus, that top part of our brain or midbrain, is responsible for those executive functioning skills like problem solving, organization, and learning. Being sensitive to touch, loud noises, and strong smells. Having a hard time with peer relationships, maintaining healthy relationships, being able to resolve conflict in a positive and healthy way might be another sign or symptom that someone may struggle with. Having issues with substance abuse. Now remember, we talked about the more trauma you pour into someone, the more likely you are to develop some unhealthy patterns, unhealthy coping mechanisms. And then engaging in those high risk problematic behaviors, being at a higher risk for suicide as well. Things like overeating, lack of sleep, substance abuse, homelessness, poor performance at work and at school. So sort of being on like a pipeline, almost like that school to prison pipeline kind of thing. Our body is going to show up and respond to a threat in one of three ways. Some theorists have also included fawn as a response, but traditionally it's that fight, flight, freeze response. And that's just your body's natural reaction to danger. Remember, I talked about in the very beginning of those pups who had never been introduced to the smell of cherry blossoms. And when they were immediately scared, right? They immediately went into freeze mode, right? Same thing with humans. A person who has experienced trauma, and this can also be an intergenerational trauma, may have a heightened stress response. When that happens, your body is being flooded with hormones. This is a completely automatic response. It's not something you can necessarily control any more than you can tell your heart to stop beating, right? So your body is being flooded with adrenaline and cortisol. Your heartbeat is increased. Your breathing may become increased and rapid. Your vision and hearing become more acute. And it takes time for those things to diminish. With my younger girls, I will talk to them about resetting their body, right? It takes time to reset your body. No one calms down just because you said calm down, right? That doesn't happen. This is an automatic hormonal thing that's happening inside of you. And it's going to take a little while for your body to come back online and your brain to come back online to feel safe. So again, looking at that fight, which is coming from the sympathetic nervous system, maybe irritable, angry, aggressive. You might even be moving towards the threat. Who are you talking to? You're not going to talk to me like that. So you're becoming very aggressive. Some of us will go into that flight mode. I got to get out of here, right? I'm having feelings of anxiety and fear. I'm panicking. I have to avoid this situation. You might even be replaying something that you said this morning over in your head throughout the day. Well, what if I had said this? Or maybe I should have said that. Or what if this happened? So almost like chronic worry. Others go into that freeze mode. So being withdrawn, disassociating, feeling ashamed, depressed, spacing out, maybe even collapsing or fainting. I know for me, my trauma response is fawn. I really don't like to disappoint people. I have a really hard time setting boundaries and then not moving them further and further back. I have a really hard time with saying no, right? And I know that's my trauma response. And so these are just some ways that our bodies and brains respond to trauma. Again, with program, organization, or system, you want to make sure that you are reshaping your policies and your procedures, mission statements, manuals to understand how racial trauma and traumatic events affect the people that you serve, right? So that could be looking at language, approach, how you're viewing behavior. You want to make sure that you're responding to that downstairs brain. Remember, we also talked about trauma brains are bottom heavy, right? So when you've had some traumatic things happen to you, maybe you haven't had the ability to necessarily walk upstairs to pull out one of those decision-making strategies. You may lack empathy or control over your emotions or bodies because you are caught up in that fight, flight, freeze response. That downstairs brain doesn't always allow us to think before we act, because that amygdala, which is, you have two of them, they're in your brain. We call that, in my house, your barking dog. I have a 4 and 7-year-old. We call that our barking dog. So our barking dog is telling you you're not safe, right? And so your body's responding in one of those ways. Some things that you can do if you're working with clients or students, colleagues, even those in your family, to help them to regulate or reset is to first help them to understand that they're safe. So with my 4-year-old, I will say to her, Rosie, my job is to keep you safe, right? I'm using very little interaction. She can't access that upstairs part of her brain because that barking dog is telling her, I am not safe and I've got to get out of here, right? So we first want to help them regulate by reassuring them and letting them know that they're safe. The next thing you want to do is relate. So validating their feelings. And so I'm going to say, Rosie, my job is to keep you safe. You seem, she will sometimes say mad. And I'll say, you do seem mad or maybe frustrated, right? So then I'm connecting with her. and her body and brain is starting to come online, right? Then that final step is walking up to that top brain, going up those stairs to the upstairs part of the brain where the problem solving, the reasoning portions can happen from the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex comes back online, and now you can reason with someone. So again, acknowledging those feelings, low and slow. I'm typically talking in the tone that I'm using right now. You want to minimize talking as well. So I'm not saying a whole lot. I'm not screaming, yelling. I'm not doing all that. I'm sort of just allowing this person to be. With co-regulation, I also want, again, using Rosie as my example, I want Rosie to come into my weather and not me to go into hers, right? So I don't want to become the storm with her. I want to pull her into my calm, right? Almost like a transfer of energy. If I notice that Ava, my 15-year-old, is the trigger for whatever's going on with Rosie, I'm probably going to ask Ava to go somewhere else. If I'm the trigger, I'm probably going to be the one to go somewhere else, right? So you want to remove any threats or triggers that may be there as well. Also, getting someone walking, moving, anything that can engage the right and left side of the brain. So there's some breath work activities that you can do. You can stand up, and anything that crosses the midline, right, is helpful with bringing your brain and body back online. Anything that includes rhythm, dancing. Sorry, my 7-year-old is like screaming in the background of anything that includes rhythm, patterns, repetitive movement or motion, having weighted blankets, fidgets, gum, music, directed exercises. These are all great ways to engage that downstairs brain, to let that barking dog, the amygdala, know that you're safe, right? And that you don't have to come all the way out of your doghouse. We're going to make sure we respond to the need and not the behavior. Again, tapping into that amygdala, that barking dog, that downstairs part of the brain to reassure the student, the client, our coworkers sometimes that they're safe. Then making a connection with that midbrain, that emotional brain, right? Before we try to access that thinking brain. And this is how you grow neuroplasticity. This is how, remember we looked at that picture that looked kind of like Christmas lights. This is how you form new connections and neural pathways. Our brains grow through healthy experiences and relationships, right? And so just because you've had a certain amount or certain level of trauma poured into you doesn't mean that all hope is lost. So we want to make sure that as we move through this work, we change our language from what is wrong with this person to what has happened to this person. Making sure that we are assessing our environments and that they aren't stressful or toxic to our clients, our staff, and that they also fulfill the organization's mission. We want to make sure that the environment feels collaborative, that people don't feel like they're only being seen as their label, i.e. an addict, a Black student, and first generation student, right? We want to also make sure that the trust is maintained and not violated. Again, that we do things with our students and clients and not just for them, right? And also we want to resist using punitive forms of treatment. And so if you have any questions, I would love to have them in the chat. We have just a few more moments. I hope that we would make it all the way to the end. And also just remembering that anti-racism work is really hard work, right? And it's okay to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? It takes action to confront and actively reject racism, right? And there are lots of ways that you can practice allyship, but it all starts with yourself. It's not binary. Racism is not binary. It's a spectrum that we all exist in. And it's really important that we think critically about those systems, right? And so again, looking at how I thought racism worked, right? Are you racist? Check yes or no. But how it actually works, right? There's a huge difference between overt racism and then also anti-racism. Most people are somewhere in the middle. There's some just additional strategies that go over self-soothing versus self-care. So sometimes we engage or should engage in those self-soothing things like grabbing a drink from Starbucks or taking a bubble bath, where as self-care is more like therapy, exercise, yoga, those things that really tend to our hearts. Also looking at mutual aid, how we show up for our communities, how we provide care within structures, right? Do we have systems for childcare for all? Is my organization or job paying our employees a living wage? Do we offer paid family leave? Those kinds of things would be structural care. And then just also, in closing, making sure that you're setting a boundary for self-care. There's a lot of research that shows that racism and poverty are toxic to a developing brain, right? It's very similar to the impact of alcohol and drugs. Also looking at things like microaggressions, they can be damaging to one's self-esteem. So being followed while you're in the store, stop and frisk policies, driving while Black, touching someone's hair. Those are like microaggressions, I would say. And also just being sensitive to those who do frequently encounter historic oppression, harassment, and racial trauma, and understanding that it can cause a sense of helplessness and fear. And make sure you're taking lots of breaks from the news, breaks from social media if you need to, brain breaks, media breaks, breaks from screens, utilizing your sick time and your personal time when you need to. I know I was very hyper vigilant last summer. We participated as a family in a lot of the demonstrations that were occurring. My daughter is 15 and she's a social justice activist. And so I was doing a lot to support her work. But I remember one night I had a nightmare and I literally jumped straight up out of my bed. So I needed to take a break from some of those things and just giving yourself permission to do that as well, so that you can find some balance, making time for yourself. If you're caring for kids or pets, making time for them throughout the day as well, making sure that self-care and self-compassion are priorities. And again, setting those limits on technology. Recovery is possible. Having a strong relationship with at least one competent, caring individual makes that happen. It helps to regrow those neural pathways that can be disrupted by trauma. We all want to feel connected to something greater than ourselves. We all want to have our talents and abilities nurtured and recognized, right? And so, yeah, resilience is the ability to overcome some of these adversities. And so now with that, that's our closing. If you have any questions that you maybe dropped in, I would love to answer them. And if not, you can reach me at alynch@grscan.com. If you would like any additional resources or anything like that, I love to receive feedback and follow up.
If that's okay, Amanda, can I put your email into the comments and for people
Absolutely.
that perfect.
Sure. Thank you.
Awesome. We don't have any questions at the time, but you do of course have praise. Beth Tully says you rock. Thank you for
Beth.
she said thank you for this awesome presentation, great information, and I will definitely echo that. I love the tools and things that we can all put in our little toolbox as we continue to have these really important conversations. And I guess one other thought is when talking about generational trauma, one question that came to mind, have you seen any, we talk about trauma in the form of like a traumatic event, PTSD, and generational trauma seems to be a newer concept that we're pushing to make sure that providers know about. Have you noticed any shift in language or change in how providers address generational trauma over the last couple of years?
Well, I think for me, one of the most glaring examples, in my opinion, is the numbers of those persons in the Black American community who are hesitant and resistant to the COVID-19 vaccine, right? And a lot of that stems not from lack of information, but I think because of some of the medical mistreatment that we've seen, over the last 400 years. And so I think there's been a concentrated effort to take things into the community with the health department, with private doctors, insurers, and those kinds of things to sort of address that. Also, with the rise in Black doulas, I think has also been helpful in reducing the numbers of fetal fatalities, because that number is very high. And I know that that's always on my radar because of having three, I would say very traumatic pregnancies with my girls. I think that we can also look and hope that our schools will shift. And again, this all requires funding so that more Black and Brown students do go into professions like mental health. There are times when I have needed to look for a play therapist, for example, and wanting kids to feel like their play therapists look like them, either in gender or race, and it can be like looking for a unicorn almost. And so I think as we encourage kids to go into some of these fields, that some of these things will shift as well.
Thank you. Yeah. And we are doing a shameless plug on NAMI Virginia for a second. We are doing, you brought this to my head. Our Youth Move Virginia chapter is actually going to be hosting a panel discussion in August for any youth who's interested in the mental health field or like taking on those roles. So if you are watching this and you have a youth or young adult at home who is interested in that information, please have them follow the Youth Move Virginia Facebook page too. So
thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, well, thank you. Again, getting a lot of thank you so much, very informative. So, and I will say the one thing that my takeaway is I always feel super seen when you bring up fawn in your research, because I'm like, that is, yes.
When I saw that, I was like, that can't be a thing.
Yeah, that's me.
There's no way not having healthy boundaries is a trauma response.
But then you think about it, you're like, yes, it makes perfect sense. Yeah. But yeah, I definitely love that they are incorporating that in the newer research. So, but I don't see any, again, great info. Thank you. So if you guys have questions for Amanda, please put them in the comments or email her. I'm going to put her email address in the comment section. Of course, you can watch this back after we stop going live. So I will, on that note, we will go ahead and end our Lunch and Learn for today. Again, Amanda, thank you so much. I really love watching this presentation with you every time you do it. So we appreciate you being here. And thank you everyone who's joined us live and everyone who will be watching this later on this week or during the day. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday.
Thank you. It's good to see you as always.